All right, so Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is back at it again, getting himself into a little bit of hot water as the Florida Department of Education has instituted some updates in terms of how exactly they want to go about teaching the history of slavery here in the United States. So here to start us off from Politico, they say new Florida teaching standards say African Americans received some personal benefit from slavery. Okay, so what are they talking about here? They say Florida education officials approved new standards for teaching African American history on Wednesday in response to the anti-woke policies touted by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis as critics urge the state to rethink the curriculum, claiming that it only represents half of the story and half of the truth. And I think, honestly, that's a little bit generous there, but they say the new standards, backed unanimously by the State Board of Education, encompass the controversial 2022 law regulating how race can be taught in Florida schools, something that was specifically sought by the Republican governor and the presidential contender. And I mean, keep in mind, I've talked about this before. Ron DeSantis has sort of made like this anti-woke crusade, this anti-CRT, anti-LGBTQ sort of crusade, the central focus of his campaign, and it's just not sticking. It's not working. It's not something that you can base an entire presidential campaign on, but that's what Ron DeSantis has been trying to do, and this is just a part of that. They say board members and state officials defended the updated curriculum that they say touches on the darkest parts of U.S. history against charges by opponents, including the state's largest teachers union, that the changes are an attempt to whitewash what students are learning. They say the state tweaked its history curriculum to match the so-called Stop Woke law that takes aim at lessons over issues like white privilege, created by new protections for students and workers, including that a person should not be instructed to feel guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress due to their race, color, sex, or national origin. I mean, again, look at what they're saying here, right? That a person should not be instructed to feel guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress. Okay, we're talking about class lessons where you're discussing incredibly brutal, incredibly violent pieces of history throughout the United States, right? If you're a white person, as I happen to be, right, and you're going through some of these lessons, it's not that teachers should be telling white students, like, you should feel guilty, you should pay for the crimes of potentially your ancestors or whatever the fuck. No teacher is even saying that in the first place, but what they're doing by, instituting this any other form of psychological distress is basically they're saying we should not teach things that in any way, shape, or form make a white student uncomfortable in the slightest, which is just completely ridiculous, because if you look at the history of the United States, whether it's chattel slavery or whether it's the Jim Crow laws and apartheid in the United States, those things are uncomfortable to discuss, right? I mean, it's incredibly uncomfortable. It's a sensitive topic. It's, again, a violent and a brutal history that we're discussing there. It's inevitably going to make people uncomfortable. It's not that like an individual right now in the year 2023 should feel guilty for the sins of other people throughout history. It's just recognizing the actual reality of the situation, and if you actually teach the reality, then that's going to make some people uncomfortable. That's perfectly fine. It is okay to learn things that are uncomfortable truths throughout history, believe it or not. But they say some of the issues raised surrounded standards that include instruction on, quote, how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit, and lessons that touch on acts of violence perpetrated against and by African Americans. Okay, so I mean, again, trying to sort of play this like double standard as if there's sort of like some sort of a comparison here to be made between the violence that was wielded against African Americans in the United States, right, during chattel slavery, during the Jim Crow era, right, and sort of trying to equivocate that or equate that to resistance against that incredibly corrupt and brutal system of African Americans, maybe in some like slave rebellions, for example, that you would teach about that, and that somehow these are like equivalent. Oh, there was violence on both sides. I mean, it's just completely insane, right? But again, that slaves would have some skills that were developed for their personal benefit. I mean, we're talking about slavery. We're talking about slavery, right? If a slave, unless you're talking about like some very specific rare instance where somebody was a slave right before the Civil War and they learned some skill and then happened to go, after they were, freed after the Civil War, go develop some sort of a business that was specific to the skill that they learned as they were a slave. I mean, we're talking about like incredibly, like maybe there's one or two examples of this happening throughout American history, right? But they're trying to portray this as if like this was some sort of like a jobs program or something like that, as if if they weren't like the property of white enslavers at the time. I mean, first of all, if you're talking about, skills developed during the era of slavery, right, that would be to the benefit of the slaveholder, right? That would increase the value of what the slave is actually capable of doing if they develop some skills, whether it's like blacksmithing or agricultural work or whatever the case may be, as we're going to get to here in a second. That would be to the benefit of the person who is keeping them enslaved, right? We're not talking about like a situation where if it wasn't for slavery, this person would have never learned this skill. No, we're talking about like incredibly rare situations here, and the vast majority of the cases that we're talking about here, again, they were enslaved people. They were enslaved when they were, either came over here, they were enslaved when, they were born here, and they were enslaved basically throughout the entirety of their lives. I mean, that's the vast majority of what the conversation actually should be, but they're trying to, again, try to like equivocate here, trying to equate these kinds of situations and pretend as if there was some like moral good that came out of slavery, right? But now we get to Ron DeSantis's direct response to this, and I want you guys to keep in mind that like he had an influence in directing this kind of an education policy, right? He's going to try to deflect here on that, but here was his response on, some of the pushback that came in the wake of this announcement from the Florida Department of Education.
Talk to them about it. I mean, I didn't do it, I wasn't involved in it, but I think what they're doing is I think that they're probably going to show some of the folks that eventually parlayed, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life. But the reality is, all of that is rooted in whatever is factual. They listed everything out. And if you have any questions about it, just ask the Department of Education. You can talk about those folks. But I mean, these were scholars who put that together. It was not anything that was done politically.
Okay. I mean, wasn't done politically? Really? The Stop Woke Act was not implemented politically? The whitewashing of the legacy of slavery in a southern state like Florida, that's not done with any political intent whatsoever. They're just purely academics. They're scholars who are working on this program and trying to get to the root of the truth. Absolute nonsense, absolute bullshit. And we'll get to a couple of threads here in a minute that will walk through exactly some of the instances that Ron DeSantis is referencing here, specifically on like blacksmithing skills that some people may or may not have learned, and you're going to see just how much of bullshit artists these people actually are and how ahistorical this piece of legislation actually is. But before we get to those threads here, I just want to check in with the Tucker Carlson replacement, Jesse Waters, over on Fox News and see how he's discussing this. Okay, so basically Kamala Harris came out, she made some responses, she was criticizing this standard of education in Florida, and he is doing this entire monologue with this, absolutely insane background behind him of, calling out Kamala Harris and saying she's warping history. We're not the ones warping history. And he brings on somebody who is actually directly involved in curating this, this education standard in the state of Florida. So let's just go ahead and see what they got to say about this.
ABC News, which is owned by Disney and is out to get Ron DeSantis, spoke to one of the academics who created the curriculum. He said this.
It is the case that Africans proved resourceful, resilient, and adaptive, and were able to develop skills and aptitudes which served to their benefit, both while enslaved and after enslavement.
But what ABC didn't air was this.
The only criticism I've encountered so far is a single one that was articulated by the Vice President, and which was an error. As I stated in my response to the Vice President, it was categorically false. It was never said that slavery was beneficial to Africans. What was said, and anyone who reads this will see this with clarity, it is the case that Africans proved resourceful, resilient, and adaptive, and were able to develop skills and aptitudes which served to their benefit, both while enslaved and after enslavement.
All right, I just want to pause on that for a second, right? Slaves utilized skills that they learned on the job, I guess you could say, or at least it seems like what his implication here is, that they learned skills that were applicable to their benefit while enslaved and after they were enslaved. Okay, just pause on that for a second. While enslaved. Okay, so you learned skills that were to the benefit of keeping yourself alive as a slave, or were to the benefit of potentially making you more valuable to the person that was enslaving you at the time. I mean, listen, at just a fundamental level, you could make this case for absolutely any atrocity or any situation for that matter throughout history, regardless, okay? You could say the same thing about the Holocaust and say, oh, some Jewish people, while they were in concentration camps, later went on to use skills that they developed in the concentration camps that were to their benefit later in life, right? I mean, you could say, oh, they learned to, live on a reduced calorie diet while they were in the concentration camps, and later that helped them with dieting later in life. I mean, it's a completely absurd and ridiculous argument that you could apply to any atrocity throughout world history, right? And so the question is really not like, was there ever some slave who developed skills while they were a slave that then benefited them later in life? That's not the real question. The real question is, why the fuck are you framing this discussion in that way? Again, trying to find some sort of like a moral good that came from this system, or trying to downplay the barbarity of this system of chattel slavery in the United States. That's the actual question, is like, it's not about like whether or not this could or could not have hypothetically happened at some point in history. It's just about, is this really how we want to frame the discussion with young people who are learning about the darkest period in American history? No, obviously not, but he continues here.
One of the authors of the Florida curriculum, Dr. William Allen, joins me now. So Dr. Allen, why do you think Kamala Harris is being dishonest about what's being taught about slavery?
Permit me not to give you Kamala Harris's motives. They are invisible. I don't know them. We can all have suspicions that there's a dishonest purpose afoot. But what's more important than that dishonest purpose is the truth. And this curriculum is devoted to telling the truth, whereas Kamala Harris has retailed a lie. Now, it may only have been a falsehood the first time she stated it, but when you repeat a falsehood, it becomes a lie.
Tell her right now what specifically this component of the slavery course teaches.
Well, permit me to have Frederick Douglass tell her. He wrote an autobiography in which he described how the mistress of his slave owner began to teach him to read. She pulled back the curtain through which a glimmer of light shone before the master forced her to close it. But that glimmer of light was enough for Frederick Douglass to illumine a bright flame that he exploited to his benefit and his country's benefit thereafter.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and cut off that clip here. Now, I want you guys to think about how he just framed Frederick Douglass as a part of this conversation with Jesse Waters. And keep in mind, again, this is a guy who was instrumental in drafting this kind of curriculum, right? Okay, he just basically said that it was because somebody who was a mistress to his slaveholder at the time, taught him some rudimentary, language skills, or taught him some rudimentary writing and reading skills at the time, that is what allowed him to later go on to become this greatly influential figure. That is a lie. Okay, because if you actually go and read some of the statements from Frederick Douglass himself, as pointed out here by Alexander over on Twitter, they say, Dr. Allen is again lying here, and this time we are forced to conclude that it is perniciously. He spins a tale about Frederick Douglass and the source of his learning to read, glossing over his mistress's role in actively trying to prevent him from learning to read as before. Let's fact check. Now, I'll link down below this entire tweet thread if you want to go and read through this for yourself, but essentially the main gist of this is that it wasn't the mistress of his slave owner that caused him to be inspired to go learn how to read and become this great orator and this great writer and all of those things, right? It was actually the opposite of that. It was because of the statements of his slaveholder at the time, who said it was extremely dangerous to allow a slave to learn these kinds of basic fundamentals, these basic education skills, okay? It was because of the pushback from his slave owner that, and the slave owner seeing, enslaved Americans learning these skills as a direct threat to the institution of slavery, right? That is what motivated him to go out and learn these skills on or by himself, right? But he framed that initial conversation with Jesse Waters as if this was some sort of like benevolent thing, or this was some sort of like, an intentional, sort of like benefit to Frederick Douglass at the time that the institution of slavery gave to him. No, it was in spite of the institution of slavery, and, to push back against this and to, understand how education was a weapon, or a lack of education was a weapon to keep people enslaved at the time, and to not fully understand the situation to be able to come to grips with it and to organize and to try to fight back against it. That is what motivated him to go and go about that process by himself, right? But again, trying to pretend as if this is some sort of like a bright spot from the institution of slavery that, brought about somebody like Frederick Douglass. Now, I want to finish off here basically with this long thread that was put together again by the same person over on Twitter, and credit to them for actually putting this together and giving us a full list of all of the falsehoods that are within this Florida curriculum. So essentially, here are some of the basic examples that they put together to try to give, some sort of a perspective in terms of some slaves that learned some skills that later went on to benefit them in life. And it turns out essentially all of these are either like super unclear or just completely false. Okay, so a couple examples here. They say, this is a statement from the two people who wrote the Florida's New Education Standards on Slavery. In it, they give several names of people to exemplify slaves who learned skills that they applied later in life. So here are just some examples. The first one is called Ned Cobb, who was listed as a blacksmith. Ned Cobb was a tenant farmer and an activist who was born in 1885, 20 years after the emancipation of slaves. Okay, that's the first example. The second is named Henry Blair, who was also listed as a blacksmith, right? Cited there by Ron DeSantis just a minute ago. There is no evidence that Henry Blair was ever enslaved, and the fact that he could register patents is evidence that he was not, in fact, ever enslaved. The third, Lewis Latimer, who is also listed as a blacksmith. Lewis's parents escaped slavery, obtained their freedom in Massachusetts, and eventually Lewis was born a free man in free Massachusetts. The fourth, John Henry, also listed as a blacksmith. Details about the facts of the real John Henry are disputed, and his status as a slave is principally a folk hero. The fifth, James Fortin, listed as a shoemaker. James was a free-born African American and a sailmaker, not a shoemaker. The sixth is Paul Cuff, listed as a shoemaker. Paul was also born free and was a whaler, not a shoemaker, apparently. I mean, this shit is just ridiculous. The seventh, Betty Washington Lewis, listed as a shoemaker. Betty was the free white sister of George Washington, the first president of the United States, and a slave owner. The eighth, Jupiter Hammond, listed as a fishing and shopping industry worker. Jupiter is the first name in the list who so far was actually a slave in his life, and as a writer and a poet. If he worked in that industry, it was in that capacity. The ninth, John Chavis, listed as a fishing and shipping industry worker. John Chavis was free from birth, never enslaved, and worked as a minister and a teacher. So you're starting to get a little bit of a glimpse here in terms of how they are trying to warp reality, how they are trying to warp history to downplay the barbarity of the system of chattel slavery in the United States. I mean, we just lifted off 8 or so of these examples, and almost all of them were of people who were never even enslaved in the first place. I mean, these are the standards that are being put in place in the state of Florida for kids to learn about this system, about this institution. And so again, it's not even just about maybe there are some instances, right, where this may have happened, where some slave learned a skill while they were a slave and then they use that later in life to their own personal benefit. Maybe that happened a couple of times, but first of all, the examples you guys are putting forward right now are just provably false, easily provably false. And then on top of that, again, it's about the framing of this. Why are you bringing this up? Why is this a central focus of this education curriculum, to try to downplay the severity of the system that we are talking about here? And now I got an even better part of this here, because some black Republicans actually decided to speak out against this curriculum and the whitewashing of slavery, and essentially they are getting absolutely trashed by some fellow Republicans, by some fellow conservative voters for daring to speak out against this absolutely insane piece of legislation. Now again, obviously this is a broadly applicable phenomenon to the Republican Party in the modern era of the United States. It's not just Ron DeSantis. We have another example here which was just absolutely insane that I didn't get to cover on this channel. This was back from about a month ago at this point, early July. They say here from The Guardian, outrage as Republican says that 1921 Tulsa massacre not motivated by race. So I would encourage you guys, if you're not familiar with the Tulsa race massacre, to go Google it and do about 3 paragraphs of reading into this and actually investigating into the causes of the Tulsa race massacre, and decide for yourselves whether or not it was motivated by race. I mean, these are the kinds of things that these people are trying to do. They are trying to whitewash history in an effort to try to perpetuate the same structures, perpetuate perpetuate the same white-dominated society, the same, white-dominated sort of political and economic status quo that we have right now. That is what the intention of this is. It's not anything new. This has been something that conservatives have been doing since the 60s, since the civil rights movement, and even before that, trying to whitewash the history of this country in order to perpetuate the same exact power structures into the next generations.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying